This is a health warning. If you want to go down to Egypt to look for Abraham and all his family, to continue the intellectual journey of the book of Genesis, then leave the cinema behind you. Its vision of ancient Egypt, based on Victorian paintings like this one, is correct in all its detail, but mistaken in its broad assumptions. Egypt never enslaved other nations, nor did it build pharaohs' tombs with foreign slaves. This tells you a lot about the 19th century, but almost nothing about ancient Egypt. Let's start at the beginning. The book of Genesis tells us that the generations of Abraham, Joseph, Jacob, and Moses all went down into Egypt. But is there any scientific evidence of such foreigners ever living in Pharaoh's kingdom at all? At the archaeological site at Tel el-Dabba in the Egyptian Delta, they've dug up the very town that such travellers would have seen when they'd first crossed the deserts to go down into Egypt.
You know, it's not very often these days you can actually suddenly come across something completely new which really verifies the truth of ancient history. So most of the ancient history we've got is built on a framework of ancient books themselves and, of course, the Bible. And it's very seldom you can come across something which actually seems to corroborate things that are going on in the Bible, major events that took place over hundreds of years. So this, in the Egyptian Delta, this strange little field, is one of the most important digs in the Middle East since the Second World War. Here look just like ordinary fields, right? But just down in front of me, that is real history. It's a sort of the thing that the ancient authors and the Bible itself was talking about. It doesn't look much, does it? These few walls are going to be filled in again next year, and there'll be growing onions on here, and the archaeologists will be moving into the next field. At the moment, you can see the remains of a grain bin there from 1500 BC. Down there, a bit further, is a wall from a house of 2000 BC. That's the same time as that wonderful painting from Egypt which shows a family of foreigners arriving from Syria, from Canaan, in their wonderful robes, so reminiscent of the patriarchs and the descriptions of them in the Bible.
The reports of the Austrian archaeologists showed what modern science could make of what at first had seemed to be one of the most unpromising sites in Egypt. Under the little houses of ordinary people in small graves, they found family treasures and the very bones of the foreigners, people like Abraham and Joseph who had come down into Egypt. And at the dead men's feet, they even found the bones of the little horses that had carried them on their travels. What, then, did the ancient Egyptians think of all these foreigners that came down into Egypt? The same Egypt in which the Bible says Abraham and all his family should be included. The evidence is surprising and rather different from the attitudes you find in the Old Testament. The facts are best seen in Egypt's famous tomb paintings, like those in the 3,500-year-old tomb chapel of the Vizier Rechmire at Thebes.
Look at the amazing care and interest that the Egyptian artists showed when they looked at foreigners. How intrigued they were by them all. Here are black people from the south, and they're bringing tribute to the man who owned this tomb. What are they bringing? Logs of ebony, wild cheetahs from the desert, white desert foxes, baboons that jumped up and down when the sun came, elephant tusks, ostrich eggs, ostrich feathers, more monkeys. And look at this marvel. I bet few Egyptians had ever seen a giraffe, especially one with a monkey on its neck. And look here, a change of pace now, not animals and people from the south, but fair-skinned people, Syrians, Palestinians from the north, elegant men in long white robes, with a baby elephant and a bear from the mountains, and horses too.
Syrians brought horses into Egypt, and with them the chariot, the great Egyptian war machine. But the interesting thing about these scenes is that the artist isn't looking down at the people. He's intrigued by them. He doesn't have that modern obsession with race. You could be Egyptian whether your skin was Syrian white, Nubian black, Libyan with blonde hair, anything. It didn't matter. All you had to do was to live in the Nile Valley in the right way, put the right clothes on and change your name and you were Egyptian.
For the most part, then, the harshness and prejudice that the Egyptians show in the Old Testament is not reflected in the reality of the ancient records. Nonetheless, there's a great deal of evidence in the book of Genesis to show that whoever wrote it knew Pharaoh's Egypt and knew it at first hand. Once again, to see evidence of that, you must go into the great tombs of Thebes.
Some of these Egyptian tombs, you have to go right down into the ground, into the burial chamber itself, to find the finest paintings. This is the tomb of the mayor of Thebes. There he is, Mr. Senefer and his wife. But here in the underworld, they're dead, and it's their son who is giving them the offerings. And scenes like this are full of detail, the sort of detail that you find in the Bible stories. The eldest son it is who communes with his dead parents. The eldest son, in fact, communicates with all the ancestors of Egypt. So, for example, when Jehovah smites the eldest son, he's not just killing off a member of the family, he's breaking Egypt's connection with the dead. And that's the sort of link that you find with the Bible stories, with these tombs. You can also find quite interesting direct details of Bible stories. Like many other of these wonderful tombs, Senefer's fine paintings are just filled up with little tiny references to Bible stories and Bible things. Look at these figures here. You can see Senefer himself, the grand mayor, high public dignitary, with his wife, and she's offering him a beautiful necklace on a basket. Now, remember the incident in the story of Joseph and Pharaoh. Joseph, who comes, is a Hebrew, and he comes into Egypt, and because of his wonderful telling of dreams, gets to be made the highest official in the land. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, I will give you authority over all the land of Egypt. And what does he give Joseph? He gives him exactly what Senefer, another high official, is wearing. He gives him the seal of the king. He gives them a collar of gold, which you can even find still on mummies. You can see it in x-rays under their bandages. Very common, these great golden collars of the high officials. And he gives him fine linens. Now, this tells you something else interesting about the Bible. It tells you that the Bible is not only giving you a lot of Egyptian detail, but it's doing that typical biblical thing. It's turning something which is actually a state ceremony, something quite formal like a knighting or a coronation, into something quite personal. And in that way, the Bible is unique in the ancient world. But there's another thing this beautiful tomb can suggest to us. And perhaps it's more important than all those little details that you can read from the tomb to the Bible. And that's something to do with the vision of the people who made the place, the sheer joy of it, the grapevines, the carpets, the lovely, lively painting. It's the work of people who know what paradise is, who live in beautiful circumstances, the sort of thing that you didn't get in the rest of the ancient world. In fact, it's a vision of a land of milk and honey. And perhaps it's the first and original example of that land of milk and honey that the Israelites so desperately wanted for their own.
Here, then, you come to the nub of the thing. The deep, deep influence of Pharaoh's Egypt upon the book of Genesis. It's to do with the basic notion of what a nation is, of what a state is and of what a god can be. Ancient Egypt, remember, was the first nation-state in all the world. And Egypt, too, was a supreme example of the fruitful unison of men and gods.
The effect of this colossal kingdom upon foreigners must have been completely overwhelming. The sheer power, the size, the skill of it all. The Pharaoh, above him, the gods, the heavens, beneath him, the people, and then underneath them, the foreigners. Everything has an order and a shape here, and that single shape must have just projected itself upon everybody who came here with its supreme confidence and ability. But there's something more than that here, too, because these palaces and the temples of the gods were private, shut off, dark, secret, mysterious places. Foreigners, and most Egyptians, wouldn't have got past the gateway here. Our visitor wouldn't merely have received an impression of this open, structured state, but of something mysterious and hidden. And at its centre, a oneness of mystery and sacredness which he would never have seen. Behind these great walls would have been a power sort of throbbing away like a nuclear reactor.
This would have been ancient Egypt's greatest gift to Abraham, for it's certainly Egypt's greatest gift of the Old Testament, a vision of a calm and universal holiness. At the heart of the Egyptian temples stood the gods. Their vitality controlled the universe and made Egypt prosper. And though ancient Egypt had 1,000 gods in it, it also held a notion of an underlying holiness that ran deep beneath everything. For thousands upon thousands of years, Egyptian priests had studied and defined this sacred order and developed the ceremonials, the rituals by which Egypt had become a partner of the gods in a single universal scheme.